In this video, I'll be explaining the difference between a functional component and a class-based component in React. A class-based component in React is a component that is using syntactically that is using a class, and it has a render method attached to it, which is used to render JSX. Its syntax is as looking like a class. We are using class to create components there. It is using, as well as it extends the React component to use the features of React. Later on, talking about the functional component is functional component are those components which use the syntax of a function, which uses the syntax of a function to create components in React. And the technical difference between a functional component and a class-based component is that when a class-based component is rendered, or some changes or some side effect is happening to the class-based component, the state or that side effect is done while inside that, like class-based components are having lifecycle methods. So whenever it at any phase there is some change, the whole class is not rendering, only that method is rendering, and the render method just renders the JSX. The whole class doesn't render. But in case of a functional component, whenever there is some change in the state or re-rendering happens, the older function dies and a new function is completely created, a new state is created. So that is basically the difference, the difference. And a class-based component is having life cycle methods like component did mount, component did update. Like, these life cycle methods are there for mounting, unmounting, and updating. For these phases there are multiple methods, but in functional components there are hooks to play with the side effects, or to do anything certain when any side effect happens. So there are multiple kinds of hook in functional components, like use state, use effect. And in class-based components there are multiple lifecycle methods to handle side effects, like component did mount, component did update, and many more. In functional component there is no render method, and in class-based component there is a render method that is used to render the JSX. In terms of syntactical wise, a functional component is pretty simpler than a class-based component, and a class-based component is in terms of syntax, class-based components is little harder to understand. It is little harder to review as well. Functional components were initially stateless. In version 16.8 they got a version update, and hooks were introduced where we can use the power of where we got the power of lifecycle methods in functional components. In class-based components there were already lifecycle methods. In class-based components there were already the lifecycle methods, but it was hard to read and hard to maintain. Also, a functional component, when a functional component runs or there is any change to the functional component, it completely re-renders, a new function is created and it renders, and if there is any change it completely renders. But in class-based components it is dependent on the lifecycle methods. The class-based component remains same, but at different phases of the lifecycle method, that render method is invoked again and again, depending on the side effects of those side effects done by those lifecycle methods. And that's basically the difference between functional component and class-based components. And just one more thing, that class-based components were the oldest syntax, so they were basically in the React legacy code, which were projects that were built before. In the latest time, functional components are much more used than the class-based components.